Welcome to the Jay Martin Show, where we dissect the greatest minds in geopolitics and finance so that we can better understand the world. My guest today is Sir Stephen Wilkinson. Now, I had Stephen on the show a year and a half ago, and the reason that I wanted to bring him back, because last time I had him on, his forecast for the upcoming 24 months was a lot more pragmatic and almost optimistic relative to so many of the gloomy forecasts that we all heard a year and a half ago. Now, very importantly, Stephen's forecast ended up being correct. And so I wanted to bring him back on the show today to learn what he's paying attention to right now in the market, how he's allocating capital. This gentleman has spent decades successfully allocating capital around the business cycle and timing the ebbs and flows of liquidity to his advantage. Fascinating human being, and I always love catching up with Sir Stephen. As always, if you enjoy my work, I publish a weekly essay every Sunday. Hit the link right beneath this piece of content to subscribe. Here is Sir Stephen Wilkinson. Enjoy.
This is Jay Martin.
Here I am with Sir Stephen Wilkinson. Stephen, it's great to have you back on the program. Thanks so much for making the time.
Thank you, Jay, for having me back.
So we chatted.
Very honored.
Yeah, no, it's my pleasure. And I had you on the show about a year and a half ago, and we covered a couple major topics. One was market cycles and what you were expecting the balance of this decade to look like and why. I want to revisit that. We also talked about the libertarian mindset and how that's evolved over time, and how your journey into the, call it becoming a libertarian occurred, and how you think about that. And where we ended up sort of debating to an extent, which I want to maybe begin this conversation with, was, what is the role of a libertarian, or what is the role of what should our role be right now in terms of thinking independently? Is it enough to set an example by agreeing that if you don't bother me, I won't bother you? But maybe there's a bit more at stake right now. Tensions are pretty high. I feel like there's some pretty dramatic consequences staring us in the face right now, and some very, very deep divisions. And so what's your take on the role of a libertarian in today's culture? Is there some responsibility that we have?
That was a good question before you asked the last part, and the last part made it a really good question. So what's the role, and do we have a responsibility? I think I'll start with the role. I think the reason that I'm so fascinated by libertarian philosophy and by the libertarian program, as articulated by people like Murray Rothbard and others from that school, Harry Brown, one of them. But Rothbard, let's leave it with Rothbard, because I think he was the most articulate, and certainly was the only one who managed to weave together a comprehensive libertarian economic and political framework.
Okay.
So he I think he's one of the few people who thought it right through to the end. The real attraction is that it forces you to make libertarian thinking forces you to go firstly to first principles, and then to think it right through to the conclusion. And it's really uncomfortable, because you're used to, people who call themselves conservative will have a certain liberty-based thinking, and they'll say, yeah, I can agree with the basic principles, but it's when it comes to their practical application in law, or in the structure of society, or in allowing those principles to structure the entire organization of society, that it can get really uncomfortable. There's the typical, well, who will pay for the roads argument, or who's going to look after this, or we need some form of government. Ayn Rand was had particularly vicious criticism from the anarcho-capitalists and the anarcho-libertarian wing, in her objectivist theory, when she said, it's just stupid to imagine that human instincts will allow a society to evolve in which there is absolutely no role for government, because that's how you get chaos, and the predatory, the more predatory members of society will just ride roughshod over any principles, and it'll just be tyranny, but at a much, much lower level of tolerance. But so you've got to counter those arguments and think through, well, where do I start giving up on libertarian principles, and where do I start pushing responsibility off to some collective central agency, which we call government, to take care of that, because I don't really trust that the market or that people will organize themselves in such a way as to make egregious misuses of power or incursions on my own liberty and property. I just don't believe that will happen. Or when I say, well, that's just too cruel, because we need somebody to look after the people who are going to be left behind. And that the attraction of looking hard at the libertarian creed is that it forces you to be rigorous in your thinking. It forces you to at least recognize where you're starting to get woolly or soft, or saying, well, actually, I don't want to go quite that far. And if you want to have real fun intellectually, then you would go and read Walter Block. Walter Block has wonderful books on, or essays on, why libertarian, the case for slum landlords, or the case for child labor. So he takes deliberately offensive topics that the Overton window is very, clearly it's outside the Overton window.
Yep.
He applies libertarian principles to them and argues his way through them as to why they are a good idea, or why we need to accept these outlying cases in order to say that we have a robust structure that can stand criticism intellectually, even in those outlying cases where our bleeding hearts will say, oh, no, we can't have that. The government has to take care of that.
Yeah.
And I think in the situation that we're in at the moment, where we are seeing massive incursions into what we previously regarded as sacrosanct areas of personal liberty, whether they were there or not is a moot point. We can discuss that all day, but at least we thought they were there. And as more and more people are feeling that, then retreating to first principles and just studying that basic framework of libertarian thought is a very helpful exercise, particularly in our increasingly hystericized environment, where people are now screaming at each other the moment that they open their mouths because they're on the wrong side or the other side.
Yeah.
And that's not helpful.
No, it's such an interesting point when you bring up these offensive examples of what you might be able to argue a case for based on libertarian principles. You mentioned, child labor being one, which, anybody will respond to with disgust and say, absolutely not, right? And as you were explaining this, I was thinking, here's part of the issue we will always face is that we can't cherry pick our indignations, right? Like I'm a libertarian except for, we're all going to have a different except for, and sure, some of us will agree on most of the except fors, but we're also going to have personal ones. I'm a libertarian except for the fire department, or except for we're all going to have these exceptions. And when we cherry pick those to suit ourselves, there's the lack of alignment. So you have to bring it back to first principles. And it's a hard thing to do, though. It's an exhaustive exercise and takes a lot of work and mental energy.
A lot of work and it takes a lot of work. You have to really read hard and catch yourself responding to it.
Right. Yes.
And I think where I've been putting in my reps over the past few years, and particularly in the last year, is in constantly going back and looking at those examples and saying, what does that mean? Think it through to think it through from first principles through to nth order consequences,
Right.
and then apply that to any topic that I feel that I need to. And I found that quite useful. There's a writer on Substack called Paul Embry, who, in the wake of the UK election last week, wrote a letter to the Labour Party. He is a lifelong Labour Party member, but to the old school Labour. And he wrote a letter, open letter to the Labour Party saying, don't do this. And then listed sort of 20 things that he didn't want them to do, or that he thought that they needed to avoid doing or stop doing or doing in order to be true to what he saw as the clear Labour case. And if you look at that through with a libertarian training, it's very easy to see where somebody who is a sort of working class socialist supporter, and Paul Embry is a decent guy. He's a decent guy. He's polite. I mean, he's obviously very intelligent. He's obviously passionate about his working class roots and about the need to protect the working classes and the Labour. He calls Labour out for doing a rotten job on that. But if you read that letter with a libertarian perspective, it's a really interesting exercise to say, where is he going over a point on the railway, in his own railway, that he's accepting as fact, where in fact that very point is the point at which you say, no, that's not true. Mm-hmm. That's not the case that you're basing it on. We need to create jobs as one of them. I'm not making it up, but it's the one that sort of jumped out at me when you think, no, that's not your job. Government's job is not to create jobs. Mm-hmm. Commerce's job is to create jobs. Market's job is to create jobs. You can't pick industries. You can't pick job. It's not your job. It's not the job of government. Right. And if you go through the entire letter and say, where is he making fundamental assumptions about how society should be organized? And how do those fundamental principles, how do they stack off against or square off against libertarian ideals? And you'll find lots of them. In fact, every single one of those points, worthy as they are in their intention, the foundation that they're built on are foundations, logical foundations that a libertarian would say, no, it's not true. So right. If that's not true, if the foundation on which your intention is built is not true, well, then the whole proposition is not true. And I've found that libertarian thinking, libertarian philosophy has allowed me to be much more clear in my own thinking. I don't have to follow it to its logical conclusion in my own life. Don't know how far I'll be prepared to go if I'm genuinely an anarcho-capitalist. Not sure yet. But it's certainly helped me have a better understanding of the logic and the flaws in the logic, or the different foundational starting points that people with different political perspectives have. And that's where the fun starts, when you can start going down into the foundations and saying, well, is that true? Right. There's a huge difference between somebody who says, I believe it's the government's job to create jobs, and a libertarian who says, no, it isn't. Right. None of their business. It's definitely not their job.
No. I mean, it's from my perspective, it's the government's job to clear the way and remove bureaucracy and red tape. Sort of functions opposite today. Up in Canada, for example, we just increased our capital gains tax as a method. This is the rhetoric from the government, as a method to reinvest in the middle class. We'll tax the wealthy to reinvest in the middle class. That's the narrative coming from Justin Trudeau. And every entrepreneur is like, wait, if you're going to tax the risk taker who provides the capital to the middle class entrepreneur, you're penalizing the middle class. It's just a lack of understanding how the process works. If you remove the incentive for the investor to take the risk, then you remove the ability for the middle class entrepreneur to raise money and start a business. So conversely, by taxing the wealthy to finance the middle class, you're doing the opposite. But that's often the case where a politician is sort of like trying to land an airplane with a sledgehammer, and just swinging at stuff. And there's a detachment, obviously, from how business functions and how incentives work.
And you can go. I mean, we don't want to turn this into a party political discussion, but then the whole idea of redistribution is something that using tax to disincentivize certain behaviors and to take from one and to give to another. Was it Lincoln who said, "You don't make the poor richer by making the rich poorer"? A quote that Margaret Thatcher had in her handbag always, on a little embossed card. The whole question of redistribution, which is at the very heart of every current neoliberal government, and whether it's socialist or Republican doesn't make any difference. The fundamental premise is an incremental taxation scale. So the more, and the higher you get, the more you pay, and a redistributive system through the acts of government. That's what government sees its primary purpose as.
Right.
And then all the other things it wants to do as well. And I would question the logic of that deeply. Firstly, it's hugely inefficient. Secondly, it creates some contorted incentive systems. And thirdly, it doesn't work.
Right.
It just doesn't.
Yeah, most
work.
importantly, right?
No.
Okay, look, I want to get your take on something. So Ray Dalio published an article about 2 weeks ago, and I would say that Ray Dalio is not normally a sensational guy. I've read all his books, I've followed his career at Bridgewater. I would say he's fairly pragmatic in his perspectives and outlook as far as I've interpreted them. A couple weeks ago, he published an article that was called "It's Time to Pick a Side and Fight, Put Your Head Down or Flee," which is kind of a dramatic title. The article made a very sound case for why he thinks the probability of civil war in the US is now above 50%. He's a probability guy. And when he published a book called Principles for Dealing with a Changing World Order in 2020, he put that probability around 30%. And he put out an article a couple of weeks ago saying, based on what he's seeing relative to previous cycles of empire and power and the outcome of civil war in previous countries, he put that outcome sort of in the more probable than less probable camp. He hopes he's wrong, but that's what he sees. This was prior to the events last Saturday at Trump's appearance in Pennsylvania. First of all, what's your take?
You mean the one where he fell?
Yeah. Unbelievable, the coverage. Can you believe that? I mean,
no, I couldn't.
I don't even, how do you put an article out like that says Secret Service helps Trump after he fell, or just like Trump injured at incident? It's like, what are we, anyways, what's your take on Dalio's claim there? Do you think there's too much hyperbole in that, or is it something that you think seriously about, Stephen?
Can I back that up a bit?
Yeah, 100%.
Yes, it's hyperbole, and yes, I think seriously about it.
Okay, yeah.
So both of them, but yes to both.
Sure.
I think what you're asking me is, do I concur with his 50% plus probability?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah. So here's what I believe to be true. I believe that we are heading for a convergence of numerous cycles. I've counted 4 so far, some of them very long-term in nature. The fourth turning, or the 4 turnings that those generational swell that Neil Howe has referred to in 2 of his books. I find that to be an incredibly useful background painting. It's a sort of very broad brushstrokes. It's very generic. It has to do with social changes over time, generational trends that basically say, at this time, somewhere around 90 years ago, the the fourth turning generation was having pretty much the same experience as this fourth turning generation. And the third turning generation were having pretty much the same experience 100 years ago, and you can keep taking it back.
Yeah.
That's a very interesting proposition. And if you go back and read history with that perspective, you suddenly realize that whoever is the history and the emotional response or the social response of the people living through that period was very different depending on how old they were. So if you read about the Civil War, if you were 70, you were having a different experience of the Civil War. I mean, not just in terms of whether you were fighting or not, but than if you were 20. There were 3 generations between that, and each one of those generations corresponds roughly to the archetype that Howe is referring to. So if you take that as a reasonably accurate, albeit very low pixelated idea of where we are in the seasonal chart. So we're in the middle of winter at the moment, and we're not even we're probably at the winter solstice. And in my experience, January is harder than December. So we've still got January ahead of us in terms of where we are. We've got another, it started, as he said, it started in 2008, roughly. And he's projecting that it'll go on to 2033, roughly. So we're now 2024. So we've got 10 years, more or less, left of this. So halfway through winter. On top of that, I've been re-engaging with Bob Prechter, who was fabulously popular up until about 1988, and then disappeared off in ignominy because he got the crash wrong, but he got everything else wrong after that, or at least wrong enough for everybody in Wall Street to start laughing at him. So he sort of slunk off because he was, all in T-bills and baked beans in the cave and disappearing out of civilization because it was all going to collapse.
Right.
But over the past 40 years, Bob Prechter has been doing some sensational work on what he calls socionomics, which is the theory that social behavior and social mood, swinging from optimism to pessimism, follows natural patterns that have to do with our evolutionary attitude towards technology and progress, and that we have phases of high progress, high technology in which we overrun. We get too optimistic about what technology can do from us. We over invest. We're overly optimistic. And then there are phases of correction. And the correction phases are shorter than the upswings because we are generally on a technological and consciousness trend that is moving slowly from bottom left to top right. If you follow his Elliott wave socionomic theory, then the grand supercycle that he talks about, which started in 1932 at the very bottom of the 1929-33 depression, then that is about to come to an end. That we're in the sort of it more or less maps the 4 turnings, more or less.
Yeah.
And there's a certain at least congruence between the waves and the rhythm of that cycle to that generational seculum that Howe talks about. That, I'm not nearly as deeply into that. I'm just sort of starting to get my head around the socionomics. I've always had an issue with the sort of Fibonacci fractal accuracy that Prechter and his disciples put into measuring the Elliott waves, because it always seems as if they're slightly adjusting it to take account of what actually happened. So I'm a little bit more skeptical of that, but I don't want to dismiss it. I definitely am not dismissing it out of hand, but I'm not quite sure it's as measurable as they would like it to be. Mm-hmm. Ante rather than post hoc. But that's one you can overlay, and that's definitely coming to some sort of crescendo in these next 3 to 5 years. And And then underlying that, you've got the Kondratiev wave, which is a 2 times 26, 26 up, 26 down, so a 52 or 53-year wave. I think it's 26 and a half, which is due to peak, the commodity cycle due to peak in the late 2026. And then you've got the land cycle, which has been as regular as clockwork, with one small interruption in the Second World War on an 18.6 year pendulum with 14 up and four and a bit. So 14 and a bit up and 14 and 4 and a bit down. That bottomed or peaked last time in 2008, bottomed in 2012, and which is also seeing the ending of the 14 and a bit year upswing in 2026. So there's an awful lot of convergence coming to the beginning of the second half of this decade, which seems to tie into, and if you use it as a map and say, okay, it's not going to be entirely accurate, not entirely, but it's good enough to start making, to start fitting what we are seeing happening around us into an overall tapestry of cyclical movement. And if you give any credence to it, and I can't see why you wouldn't want to, I mean, it's very tempting to say, oh, so we've got this map. And as I say, it's not 100% accurate. But, and then I'm now going to answer your question about Dalio. Dalio's 50% plus for some cataclysmic event that will change the social dynamic, structure, and cohesion of the United States makes sense against two factors. Factor number one is the fact that there is a convergence of cyclical movements pertaining towards some sort of apex moment in the next 3 to 5 years, with a 4 to 6 year downturn afterwards. That sort of makes sense. Risks are increasing. What I think is driving the hyperbole, why this time it's not just going to be something, a mild type of, I don't know, 1973, 74 type, or even a 2008, 9, 10 type. What I think is driving it is the extraordinary level of debt and the corruption of money in the money system that so many of your guests have talked about. Even I talked about it a year ago. There is, I think, for those of us who are not moral relativists, and you started this podcast with a very strong precious metal and gold focus, the people who believe in gold as a hard money, they are not relativists, they're absolutists. They believe that there are absolute standards of behavior. They believe that there are absolute values. They believe that there is a moral code that governs our behavior, and if we stick to it, we will be successful, and if we leave it, we will not be successful. Ultimately, our own weakness, through our willingness to make everything relative to everything else, will lead us astray. It's a bit like walking in the desert. If you think you're walking in a straight line, in fact, after a day and a half, you come back to where you were and find your footsteps. We think we're being, if you only have a relative coordination system or coordinate system, you'll be going around in circles. It's only when you have a compass with a true north that you actually make progress. And I believe that we are so far down the relative values path, and the results of that are so egregious in the level of debt, the ethics of money production, the distance of money from being a true store of value to being nothing. I mean, we just have to look at what our dollars and our pounds and our euros are actually worth in terms of their purchasing power. Just for fun, and I keep a list that I regularly update of the things that we buy in the household. and I've been keeping it for an awfully long time, and I do it in gold. What does it cost in, what does 6 eggs cost, or a liter of milk, or whatever it is, or a car, or a normal size house, or what does it cost? What's average rent? What's average take home pay for, blue collar workers, white collar workers, and highly skilled work? And what are they getting paid? And you will see that over time, the amount of gold that each one of those units could buy, or the value of gold in respect of those individual commodities, is extraordinary. I mean, the decay, I can't think of any other word for it, the decay of currency is so far from a store of value that, and it's accelerating, that it will have to end, if it's not already ended, we just don't know it, very soon. And I think the next crisis, whenever it is, 26, 27, second half of this decade, is going to be of much larger proportions than the ones that we've experienced in the past 100 years, or 90 years, possibly since the 1930s, because of the amount of debt and the weakness of the system, the institutional weakness that we've experienced, and we experience every day of our lives. And that is typical for the fourth turning. So what we're seeing now is what you would expect to see if the fourth turning theory or the seculum was correct. And so all of those things coming together make me believe that Dalio's percentage probability of being more than 50% is more than 50%, more than half likely that there will be something cataclysmic. And did he say civil war? Is that the thing that he was looking for?
He points to civil war, but he points to a few different forms of civil war. When we hear civil war, we think of the American Civil War. He uses that as one example. Yes, that's a possibility, but he also pointed to a couple sort of non-violent civil war outcomes where you just had essentially like state separatist movements, right? Or
I would put that at 80%.
Right. Yes. Okay.
I would put that at an 80% possibility. I'll tell you why. My understanding is that if you look at this in a sort of larger meta context, the nation state, we think nation states have been around forever, but they really haven't. They are a product of the early Enlightenment that essentially came about after the Treaty of Westphalia, after the European powers had been bashing their heads in for each other. They call it the 30 Years' War, but it was a much longer conflagration that was set in motion by the schism between what then became the Protestant Church and the Catholic Church, or Protestantism, which comes from protest, and the traditional Christian organization of the Catholic Church. Catholic, the word Catholic means global. That's what it means. So all over the world. And the Protestants broke away from that, and it caused a dreadful schism and war, and an opportunity to break up the power hegemon of the Holy Roman Empire, which was the America of its day. Before that, Europe was organized into many, many, many smaller states, each run by a prince or a duke or some aristocratic head, other than the Hanseatic towns, which were organized by merchants. So they got rid of the aristocrats, and they were organized around commerce. And they're very useful. It's very useful to look at the Hanseatic League, because I think they give a model for what might come afterwards. So the reason that nation states were founded was because the logic of power was you needed larger territories so you could have larger populations, which fed to larger armies. Larger armies needed larger bureaucrats, and you needed larger bureaucrats to manage those larger armies, and you needed larger bureaucratic organizations to run the taxing system in economies that were then largely agrarian, but slowly moving to commerce and trade.
Okay.
So you can start. This is before the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, which is effectively science and capital coming together to create usefulness out of these scientific inventions, generally to save labor or to increase the productivity of labor. That's what they were for. So you needed these larger entities, which usually started with some more belligerent, well-organized state reaching out and assuming responsibility for the neighboring ones. And the biggest one, of course, was Prussia and Bismarck. And Bismarck created the nation of Germany out of a huge conglomeration of smaller and medium-sized and larger states. So the state that we know, the country, I think it's outlived its usefulness because we don't need economy. They've overreached their economies of scale. So where previously size was an advantage,
yeah,
and it was, there's no question, it gave you bigger armies and bigger taxable base, bigger supply of young men to feed your armies, and you could go and conquer territories which would expand and so on. And we've seen that richly throughout the last 400 years. However, technology has advanced to a point where we don't need that anymore. Mm-hmm. The next wars are going to be fought with drones, and they are being fought with drones. They're not going to be fought with the same technological military structures that we've seen in the past. A lot of it is going to be almost like video games. Mm-hmm. Of course, there'll be massive suffering on the ground, but that's sort of statistics. The actual military capabilities are going to be completely different, which means that, and it's going to be much cheaper. The economies of scale and the advancement of technology isn't stopping at military use. In fact, it's probably being accelerated by military use. So the original idea that you needed this state as a taxable military unit, that I think has become obsolete. And we have the technology, we have the understanding, we have 400 years of reasonably rational enlightenment. We have education. We have a much more educated population than we've ever had before. People don't need the state in the same way that the state needed to exist 200 years ago or 300 years ago, and which is literally just continued because they've not had to call itself. It's not had to call itself into question. I think the time is now approaching. And I'm not quite sure how much of this is wishful thinking, where the map of the world is going to look an awful lot more like Europe in the 15th, 16th century than it did in the last, 100, 200 years, where you had these huge state blocks, mm-hmm. national anthems and one language and very strict organization. I think the next turning, this particular crash or realignment, the decay of existing institutions, will fracture the nation state into its component parts. And those component parts will find that they get on very well with the technological means that, microprocessing and possibly defense, a much, much smaller units, which are much more accountable to a much more intelligent populace than the nation state, making the nation state unnecessary. So leading into, well, what does that mean for America? Well, America has a blueprint in its constitution, which organized the previous 13 states at its founding and gave them autonomy. That constitution is still in existence. One of the things I'm never quite sure about, and nobody can tell me this, is whether prior to the Civil War, when Lincoln was making his decision, which libertarians loathe him for, to send the army in against his own people, whether the right to secede, which was anchored in the Constitution, whether that had been voided. In other words, I'm not sure whether in 1760 or in 1750 the rights of the states to secede still existed. I don't know whether it does today or not. But even if it doesn't, if the right doesn't exist, if you take the right, well, then you can do. It'd be interesting to see, the federal government saying to Texas, you can't.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and they have, to a degree, in that Texas specifically, obviously dealing with the border crisis, and Governor Abbott built his own fencing. The Supreme Court ordered him to take it down, and he responded, no, like, you're not doing your job, we'll do it for you, which is defiance against, I mean, it's sort of step one of this process, right? Where we will govern ourselves despite you, right? Not in coordination with you, which actually, I'll pull a quote from Dalio's article here. When the causes that people are passionately behind are more important to them than the system for making decisions, then the system is in jeopardy. And so that essentially says, when the time comes to take matters into your own hands, the system has to be rethought, and
that's pure Jeffersonian. I mean, that's the modern language for Jefferson's dictum that once the state no longer serves the interests of the people, then the people need to get rid of the state. And I think that what we are seeing is a slow emergence of a shift in the balance of power. And the more indebted, the more incompetent, the more corrupt, the more out of touch the center becomes, as we've seen in so many historical examples of empires sort of breaking. It's usually the periphery taking back control very slowly to start with, as they realize that the government in the middle doesn't have the power or the resources or the energy to send battalions or whatever into the periphery to go and insist on those taxes being collected. So you saw in the Roman Empire, you saw, in Gaul and in Spain and in Britain, you would see the local commanders, and the people who were sent out to look after the viceroys or whatever they were, just keeping the tax for themselves and doing whatever they saw, however they saw fit. The Roman roads were not built at the height of the Roman Empire; they were built by Romans who had power there and budget, and they just decided to build them because it was the best thing to do. So they were investing in infrastructure. Once the military threat had been removed, more or less. So that decay from the center, as the center decayed and sort of collapsed in on itself, the periphery just took matters into its own hands and could do, although they were nominally still part of the Roman Empire, they just didn't mean anything. So we may find that slow but sure disintegration of central power in all sorts of structures. I think in Europe it's going to be a real mess because Europe doesn't have that constitutional integrity or history that America has. And America, I'm looking very strongly at America because whatever happens there is going to determine what happens in the rest of the Western Christian Empire. And I think Dalio is probably right.
Can you expand on that a little bit? Whatever happens in America will potentially determine what happens in the rest of the Western Christian Empire.
Yeah, well, it's easy. If America decides that in the next crisis, the best thing for it is military dictatorship for a while, or to have the army just come in and run things, well, then that will give impetus to others who will take their example from that.
Sure. So precedent might be set in America, and whatever that precedent is.
I think America's cultural influence is so powerful, and its hegemonic leadership within the Western Christian Empire, which is a term that David Murren likes to use, and I know he's been on your show, and you had a very good conversation with him about 7 or 8 weeks ago. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah.
And David is on the extreme form, on the extreme edge of his collapse of empire, military conflict. Military conflict is a good thing. Lateral leaders will then come, sweep away all the linear thinkers. I'm a big fan of his, and that's another one of the cyclical patterns that you can overlay. So I'm sort of creating this mosaic of overlapping cycles, and they all seem to be coming to more or less the same conclusion at the moment. Now, whether that's a function of the time that we're in, and everybody's sort of gaming their cycles to fit a particular narrative, that could be true. I don't think it is. And David is very robust in his position, very robust. So I think that the probability of that, and whatever the hegemon does within our Western Christian empire, which includes Australia and New Zealand and other areas of the world that aren't immediately aligned with America particularly, or at least not geographically, I think that whatever America does will be the cultural imperative for whatever happens in the other places.
And you said, like, maybe if America decides to gravitate towards more authoritarian leadership, then that's sort of precedent or permission for the rest of the Western Christian empire to follow suit. And you could hear that and say, wait a minute, this is a country who apparently values freedom over anything else. Why would they ever gravitate towards an authoritarian leadership? When you look at the chessboard today, you see it's actually, I would almost call it probable, in that the divisions are so deep between just call it like the extreme left Democrats and the extreme right Republicans, that defeat of the opposition at any cost seems like the preferred outcome. And so you can see that occurring where there's such distaste for the opposition or the other side of the political aisle that you say, if dictatorship is what it's going to take to defeat this adversary, then we're all in on that. And I think today's landscape, you can see that as an outcome. And then you layer in things like just gross distrust in the system, the politicization of the justice system a month ago with Trump's court outcomes. I think pretty gross politicization of the court system. And when you weaponize when you weaponize the justice system against your political enemy, all you're doing is giving them permission to do that to you when it's their turn. I mean, that's what happens here, right? Precedent.
Absolutely. And you get the ridiculous situation in which the stewards who have sworn constitutionally to protect the integrity of the system to which they were elected, in Germany, for instance, saying we need to ban the AfD, who have 25% of the popular vote behind them, and probably an awful lot more people who dare actually say that they do support the policies of the AfD. You have the ridiculous situation of MPs saying blatantly we have to shut them down for the sake of democracy. I mean, that you can't get more absurd than that. So if we don't like the outcome, and quoting the 1930s and saying that look what happened and Hitler got in and we have to protect that, and if that means shutting down the party, all it's saying is that without actually making the effort to understand what it is that is driving people to those parties. And what I think I see happening is, there is still an American election to be had, and there's still a big German election to be had next year, and a Canadian election to be had next year. So if you look at the sort of the major countries of the Western Christian Empire, what you are seeing is a rise in right-wing populism to counterbalance the extreme forms of left-wing populism that we've been subjected to for the past 10, 15 years. The pendulum is swinging back, but they're not. And the entrenched governments who used to be center left, center right, are now incorporating extreme left political parties onto their side in order to combat the rising right-wing populists. So you're seeing, the Labour Party in England having just gained power with 0% increase in their share of the popular vote, collapse in the Tories, and are now forming a government. But there are 4 seats that Farage and his troop have got, and that is just the beginning. That's a rhizome that will grow. You'll see it in France. They've just tried to keep Marine Le Pen and her party out and done it successfully, but only by Macron doing a deal with a party, not one of whose policies he's going to be able to come to any sort of agreement on.
Right.
So
right.
But out of an act of sheer desperation, I'm fascinated to see what will happen in Germany next year. What we will be seeing is these right-wing populist parties kept out of power, and who knows what's going to happen in America. And we've got 5 months to go, and they're going to be very, very nervous months.
Yes.
But what I think we will see is that these attempts to game the system by the existing globalist left-wing parties that are in power, they're all going to be in power when the cycle breaks. And if that is true, then the beneficiaries will be the parties who are now on the fringe and who are fighting their way to the table.
Yeah,
they've got 20% of the vote, or 15% of the vote, or maybe 30% of the voters in the case of Marine Le Pen. They're just being kept at bay by the incumbents. But once the money breaks, once the financial system is under massive pressure, and we come into, and the chickens come home to roost from all these years of profligacy and financial corruption, I'm going to call it that because it is, then you will see that there's nothing going to be holding them back. I think this is the last cards that they're playing to keep themselves in power. And when we look next October, which is when Germany, I think September is Germany, Trudeau has got to go to the country in
25.
In 25. And again, we all look to America, because if they try to, if the incumbents try to mess around with this election, and there are some people who would say again, and others who would say leave the brackets off.
You're right.
I have no idea. I have no idea. But if they try to mess around with it and deny Donald Caesar his triumphant march into Rome, having crossed the Rubicon yesterday or in the last few days, then all bets are off. I don't know what will happen.
Right. Trudeau is early in that game. He formed the coalition with the NDP, Canada's effective Labour Party, a few years ago during the last election. And we have a very important election coming up in Canada in 2025. I feel like most Canadians are making the assumption that Trudeau is finished and the Conservative Party, led by Pierre Poilievre, is the obvious winner. I'm far less convicted in that. And maybe it's the I'd say the upsets of Le Pen in France and the Labour Party winning in England. There's been this roar of conservative uprising, but then defeated at the polls. And I have concerns about that in Canada. For me, it's not a foregone conclusion who takes the next Canadian election. I think it's a lot more uncertain than people are assuming, and that concerns me. It's not a sure thing for me. We're not just going to go to common sense, as people seem to think.
Well, I think it's correct to open up all sorts of possibilities. You have to be fairly speculative, because normative behavior has changed so much, and there's the pendulum is swinging out more and more. That means there's more volatility. There's certainly more kinetic energy on both sides, and there's so much at stake that. And as you said, the ability to give up previously held positions and to say, well, if I need the military on my side, then I'd rather have a military dictatorship on my side than allow them to come into power. If that is true, well, then we may even see the cancellation of elections. We may even see force majeure. If there's a military conflict with China, which David is extremely positive. He sees as a very high probability, almost. Yep. I think David would say that he's certain as he is of anything, that there will be a third front of this global war. First one being in Eastern Europe and Ukraine, the second one being Iran, Israel, and the third front being opened up in the South China Sea. And if that is true, depending on what shape it takes, it may well be it's enough of an excuse to say we can't have the elections now. I mean, in any country, the Germans might say, the Canadians might say, the Americans might. We have to be prepared in this phase for all sorts of monkey business because the stakes are so high.
That's interesting. I hadn't really thought about that angle, but of course, if there was an external threat significant enough that we could say our future is actually in jeopardy, and now is not the time to be deliberating over who should be leading this. We need to lead now. We need to go now. But what an opportunity for a corrupt political party to provide an excuse to delay an election. How much attention do you pay on those geopolitical threats, kind of the reshuffling of the global chessboard? You could say if you're going to make a move on the global superpower, now would be the time. The country's never been more divided, or allegedly never been more divided than it is right now. And while they're so distracted internally, now would be the time to make a move externally. And you're seeing those moves made, whether it's the epidemic of coups across the Sahel region of Africa, whether it's inroads being made all over South America, the first deep water port on the west coast of South America being built by China right now, just 50 miles north of Peru. Now there's a straight shipping route to Asia from South America. It's never existed before. So relationships can change there. And you look at the inroads they've made all over the Muslim world. I mean, Beijing, the inroads Beijing's made all over the Muslim world. Like, do you pay much attention? Do you put much weight on that, Stephen? The reshuffling of the geopolitical chessboard outside of the borders of the USA?
No.
Okay.
No, I don't. Not. I mean, the reason that I don't is because we spent a good deal of time pretending that I have any particular geopolitical insights, and I don't. Okay. I really don't.
Okay.
The only reason that I'm interested in this is because I have to make business decisions. And we've had a conversation recently about timing. From my entire professional career in finance, everybody who was serious said, well, we don't engage in timing. Warren Buffett says we don't time the market. My first boss says timing is for amateurs. We do asset allocation. I thought, oh, yes, right. But wherever I've gone in my life, making cyclical decisions correctly has been the single biggest driver of returns and sanity. And I look at Berkshire Hathaway, as we probably all do, with a great deal of respect and fascination. And I see he's got 300 billion in cash on a balance sheet of $1 trillion. And I think, oh, well, that's timing. That's timing. Yeah. Because the only way he knows, I know he's not got Charlie to talk to, but he knows that the only way he's going to drive returns is by having extraordinarily large amounts of capital to deploy when the prices are low again. He knows that. He's correct in saying, we're not going to do more than nobody should expect us to do better than our sort of 8%, and the business is designed to bring 8%, all other things being equal, which they're not, because he's got 300 billion in cash, and he is going to deploy it. And he thought he was going to have to deploy it in 2021 too, and did to a certain extent. But he's waiting. He's waiting. And then the Berkshire's cash pile is as much a cyclical decision as it is a timing decision. And nothing that I have read anywhere, nothing that in my practical observation has showed me that the best businessmen The best deployers of capital do not have a very robust opinion as to where they are in the financial and general cycle. They just do. And there are great times to deploy capital, and there are great times to finance your the liability side of the balance sheet, and there's a great time to deploy it on the asset side. But they're never the same time. They are different times. And getting that right, I don't know what else to call it other than timing, is crucial. And in order to know where you are in the cycle, you have to study cycles. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean you have to obsess about them and forget your day-to-day business. And there are a lot of people who do that. I do my business every day, and I, put my hand to the plow, and I'm plowing my furrow every day. But I've got one eye on the horizon and the weather forecast.
Sure.
And
yes.
So I think you have to have a certain degree, be able to cope with a certain degree of cognitive dissonance. You can't go, just because you think you're close to the top of the cycle doesn't mean you can go and live in a cave with a 10-year supply of baked beans with your family. That's not going to make you happy. But you have to have a fairly good idea of where you are. And that's why I think about it. And at the moment, it's telling me I may be out by a year or year and a half, but that's fine. I don't need to be any more accurate than that.
Right.
And at the moment, it feels as though we're heading into a robust period of economic growth, irrespective of what happens. If you look back at the start of any of the large wars, life went on very comfortably for the first part of it, and things only got really hairy in the second part, and we're nowhere near that yet.
Right.
So that's why so when I say I'm not really interested in what China's doing and the realignment of the global chessboard, I only look at it insofar as it plays into either supports or causes me to question the larger cyclical narrative.
Okay. Yeah. Yes. And last we spoke, you were looking at 2027 as that sort of turnover.
End of 26.
End of 26. Yes. Yeah. And
these things usually happen in late September, October, because the people who are making the decisions have come back from their summer holidays. They've had time to read some of the more larger theories. They've had time to sit down and think and stare out over the blue ocean. And they come back and they start making decisions, and the collective compounding effect of those portfolio reallocations, they work their way down like the Cantillon theory down through the hosepipe until they reach such momentum that they then reach tipping point, which is usually the end of September, beginning of October.
Yeah. There were so many doom and gloom forecasts a year ago when we spoke. There were and
everybody was expecting the recession.
Yes, and deep and hard landing, all of this, and anybody in sort of, and I'm aware, I think anybody who has an exposure to the precious metal sector tends to be a bit more pessimistic in their outlook of the economy. And I understand why, but timing, that's something different. And I was just in prepping for this, just doing a couple dives into a couple indicators, and the U.S. set a record for most passengers screened at airports in a single day only a week ago. Over 3 million passengers. Amazon's hitting 4-year highs. Consumer trends look really, really positive, which supports your, couple-year robust growth thesis. What do people miss, though? Why is the recession forecast so seductive, and why is it so consistent regardless of what's happening on the ground?
Gosh, if we could answer that. I think there's a great deal of institutional imperative to look at one or two indicators and to then just extrapolate them. We massively underestimate the natural corrective forces of dynamic human behavior.
Mm-hmm.
We're masters at extrapolating, and we are useless at genuinely appreciating the cyclical ebb and flow of human behavior. And it works in a small area and it works in the larger. Our minds are evidently, and I have no particular insights into psychology, but from what I've read, our minds are very good at going to dark places very quickly.
Yes.
I think that's what's allowed our species to survive. And given all the stimulus that we have, and given that pretty much everybody is in agreement that our flight, fight, or freeze responses are still strongly conditioned by our amygdala and our basic responses when we feel threatened, that we are very good at catastrophizing. And with the connection that we have between the people who are thinking about these things in a serious macroeconomic way, their link to the foghorns of their investment banking and brokerage departments, which are then tightly connected to the television, media programs, and social media. We have this massive amplification system that takes on a life of its own and that causes exactly the sort of behaviors that lead to extrapolating into the extreme until everybody notices, oh, wait, it's not happening. And then people walk it back slowly, but very slowly.
Right.
We were talking about a hard landing and then a soft landing, and I think we were in a no landing.
Yeah.
Was one, and then everybody started not talking about something else after that.
Yeah.
So I think by the time we got to Christmas last year,
the
last of the landing heuristics had sort of washed its way out of the system, and people were concentrating on something else.
Yeah. And I think that does drive most of it. It's the psychological bias towards disaster. And also you can call a crash, and we know people like this, you and I both, that have been forecasting the big one for a decade, and they never have to be right. They're just early, and when you predict a crash and it doesn't occur, everybody forgets the next day. When you predict a crash and it does occur, you're heralded as this oracle, and they make a movie about you, the individual who saw it was coming before anybody else. So that's a good bet.
Right. And the only, as I say, the only thing that I'm really paying attention to is actual prices.
Mm-hmm.
Actual prices. What's being paid for businesses? What's being paid public businesses, private businesses? The supply and demand of capital that's driving those decisions. Those are real. I can look at those and I can say that's real. Do I believe it or not? Do I believe that it's worth paying, 1,000 times earnings for Nvidia or whatever? And I can make a decision based on my philosophy around intrinsic value and my ability to calculate it, which, for industries that I understand, I think I can. And then you map that against the cycle. And if you're seeing extreme prices that are miles away from intrinsic value at a point in the cycle where you think, oh, well, that figures. When companies are being measured on multiples of revenue rather than multiples of earnings or profits, then you know that we're in a phase in the phases in the past in which that has been true. It has also been true that reasonably shortly afterwards, we went back to a deep value repricing, because those sort of metrics don't make sense in business. Nobody, you've got that one. Was it Scott McNealy, who gave the talk to the analysts in 2002 after Cisco's price had crashed dramatically, and he said to them, you were paying 10 times revenue. So I would have every penny that I have ever earned, I wouldn't be able to pay my wages. I wouldn't be able to pay my taxes. I wouldn't be able to pay, which I think is illegal. I wouldn't have been able to invest in anything in order for you to get your money. I would have to take all the costs out of my business.
Yeah.
All of them.
Yeah.
And then he ended his little spiel with, what were you thinking? What were you thinking when you were paying that price for my business, for the business that I'm responsible for? It's a brilliant little quote. I mean, you can just look it up. Scott McNeely, what were you thinking?
I'm going to find it.
And the single largest advantage that I believe I have, and thousands, if not tens and hundreds of millions of like me have, is we are not bound by institutional constraints. We can think for ourselves. And if we can think for ourselves, and if we can act for ourselves, then damn it, that's what we need to do. If you are an institutional manager making decisions that if you get it wrong, it could cost you your job. Howard Marks has a whole chapter in The Most Important Thing in explaining what the institutional imperative is. It's much, much more important for me not to do something that could leave me exposed to the risk of losing my job than it is for me to make a brave decision in the face of, be contrarian.
Yes.
Institutional managers are not paid for making contrarian decisions. They're just not. But we can. I can. You can.
Mm-hmm.
And that's my one large advantage. I'm assuming that if I find out about it, I'm going to be one of the last to find out about it,
okay.
Whatever it is.
Yeah.
I'm just making that assumption that I do not have an edge.
Yes.
In terms of information flow or speed or anything, but I can think for myself. I can.
Yes.
And one of the ways that I help myself to think for myself is to have an absolute set of standards and a map. So my absolute set of standards are my Christian belief system. That tells me what I have to do. And it worked, I don't know, 2,500 years ago, 3,000 years ago, when Solomon was writing his wisdom and David was singing his psalms. They seem to work pretty well. There's a lot to relate to in biblical wisdom. So that's one set. And the other set is, if you want to call it, my libertarian principles, because non-aggression and the right to property and the right to self, they seem to make a lot of sense to me. And if I can measure everything else against that in our social sphere, well, then that's great. And the other one is a value investors framework based on an understanding of Austrian economics and years of reading around that. That's my third set of principles. So if I can mingle those three to create an absolute standard of behaviors in ethics and personal behavior, in my understanding of my political stance, really what I think it's worth standing up for, and in economics and investing, that's good enough for me. And if I can put that all in context of a map of cycles, that's good enough for me. And the rest is I just mind my own business and look after the sheep. Who don't care about any of that.
Yeah, right. That's such that was a very impactful moment there, just marrying the Christian belief system, the libertarian principles, the value investing framework, and using that, as your sort of guardrails for decision making and interpretation, keeping you grounded and bigger conversation. But I think that may really help you in knowing who you are, and then when you know who you are, you know how to respond to and how to react and how to govern yourself. Which I think is more important now than ever. A lack of values is a bit of a plague in our society at present. And
you started off with a question around, what should you do and what's your responsibility?
Yeah,
that's the question you started off with.
Yeah,
and I didn't answer the second part of the question. What's your responsibility? I think your responsibility is primarily to live authentically within the strictures of your own value framework.
Right.
Number one.
Right. Yes.
That's your job. The second one, which comes very close on the heels of it, is to look after your family. I think one of the greatest acts of defiance in a socializing world is to have a family and to take full responsibility for it. For you, for your children, to provide them with safety, shelter, and surplus, whatever that surplus is. It doesn't have to be money. It can be ideas, love, self-confidence, whatever you can give that is in surplus, everything that you don't need for yourself. The next port of call is for your immediate family and for your closest friends, however you define that. The next is for your community. And only after that can you bother yourself with or should you be supplying surplus to the world. So your responsibility is exactly in that order. You put your own house in order, I think is Jordan Peterson's way of referring to it. Then your family. Then your community, however you choose to define it. Doesn't need to be your parish. It probably is to a certain extent. It could be the business communities that you're involved in. It can be whatever community, your choir, your football team, your whatever it is, whatever community you're in, just using your surplus to look after people. And then if we all did that, and then finally the broader world, that you're sharing your surplus through your ideas, through your example, through your charity, through whatever it is. We may not even know the people that you're touching with your surplus. And again, surplus is not just money. It's ideas, it's energy, it's passion, it's example, it's all sorts of things. Your writing, your podcasts, your stuff, the work that you do is touching people. But it would be worthless if you weren't looking after yourself, your family, and your immediate community, the people who work for you first.
Yeah, I love that. You were reminding me of a quote that I recently stumbled upon: build houses and settle the land, plant gardens and eat the food they grow, get married and have sons and daughters. As a general framework for living your life, it's biblical. But
Deuteronomy, isn't it?
You nailed it. Yeah, exactly. Huh. Yeah. Very cool.
Well, my favorite quotation from Deuteronomy is Deuteronomy 8:10-14, I think. And now that you've kicked the ball off with biblical quotations, the one that I think frames the entire Judeo-Christian approach to wealth creation and the responsibility of it is, and from the King James Bible, I've just pulled it up, is Moses is sitting there and he knows he's not going to go over to the promised land, and God has said, you can't go because you screwed up back in the desert. I never quite understood why he was so harsh to him, but he's saying, okay, this is what you've got to do. You're going to go over, I'm going to die, I'm going to leave you. I know you're stubborn, arrogant, and obstreperous lot, and this is what God wants you to do. And he says to them, when thou hast eaten and art full, then thou shalt bless the Lord thy God for the good land which he hath given thee. Beware that thou forget not the Lord thy God in not keeping his commandments, his judgments, and his statutes, which I command thee this day. Lest, this is the important bit, when thou hast eaten and art full, and hast built goodly houses, and dwelt therein, and when thy herds and thy flocks multiply, and thy silver and thy gold is multiplied, and all that thou hast is multiplied, thine heart be lifted up, and thou forget the Lord thy God, which has brought thee forth out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. And then he says at the end, and thou say in thine heart, my power and the might of my hand hath gotten me this wealth. Mm-hmm. And what Moses is effectively saying is three things. Number one, God fully expects you to want to have all the good things of life. He expects you to not just have a house, but houses, and gold, which is money, and flocks, which is business, and all the other things that you would do as a people that want to produce surplus for yourselves. Perfectly natural that you should want to have that and not live in abject poverty and not suffer, and he wants you to have that. But the only thing that you need to do is keep the laws, and don't forget that it's not you being unbelievably clever and hardworking, but don't forget where it comes from. It's not coming from you. It's coming from God and the bounty of the universe. So if you forget it, then that stuff will kill you.
Mm.
But if you don't, then you can enjoy it.
Yeah.
And that's it. That's the whole Christian system. It's your responsibility, and there is, good things will wait for you if you do, but you have a responsibility. You have a responsibility to yourself, to your family, to your tribe, however you define it, and then to the wider world.
I love that. I think, Stephen, that's a great place to wrap it as well. And I know I've eaten through your time, so we're probably perfect there, but beautiful way to end this conversation. And thank you so much for your time again today. It's always a pleasure reconnecting with you. So I love having you on the show.
Thank you so much, Jay. It's been great to see you again. Take care.
All right.